For this tutorial, I'm using the Media Browser project file. You can find that with the media associated with this tutorial. Just double-click on the project file to open it in Premiere Pro. I'm also using the Assembly workspace, and you can reset that workspace by clicking on the Assembly Workspace panel menu and choosing Reset to Saved Layout. The Media Browser is a panel that allows you to browse multiple media types, preview them, and import them. Here in the Assembly workspace, Media Browser shares a panel group with the project panel. Like any other panel, you can move it where you like, but it's likely you're going to want quite a large Media Browser panel to access and preview multiple files. On the left, I've got a number of different folders. Here I can expand my local C drive on Windows. This would be the Macintosh hard disk on macOS. And if I want to, I can browse down into the users folder, into my user folder. And here I've also got desktop. On the desktop, I've really just got two folders, an other files folder and a media folder. And we're going to look inside the media folder. But I think it's fair to say that browsing for the desktop through all of these subfolders is a bit of a journey. So I'm going to right-click on this desktop item on the left in the navigator, and I'm going to choose Add to Favorites. Now at the top of the list, I've got desktop as a favorite, and I can click on it at any time to access the contents. You'll notice as well, when I right-click on an item on the left, I have the option to reveal in Explorer. This would be Finder in macOS, and it just means I can open whatever I'm clicking on in the regular file browsing interface. Since I haven't right-clicked on some media, the option to import isn't meaningful just yet, and in fact the option to open a piece of media in the source monitor isn't even available, and it's the same for the option to open a project. Whatever you select on the left, here for example I'm choosing desktop in the favorites, and I'm going to display the contents of that by clicking this disclosure triangle, and then I'm going to click into the media folder. You can see that you get the contents displayed on the right. Right now I've got my thumbnails displayed particularly large, and that's a control down at the bottom of the media browser. Let's shrink that down just a little for now. You'll also notice I can toggle between viewing list view and viewing thumbnail view, but the thumbnail view is particularly useful, as you'll see in a moment. Premiere Pro allows you to open multiple projects at once, and for that matter to import whole projects. I can right-click on this project file and I can open it or import the whole thing. You can even browse inside project files within the Media Browser panel, but that's not what we're here to look at today. I want to browse inside this source folder. I'm going to double-click to open this up. You can see it's highlighted on the left in the navigator. Right at the top, I've got an option to choose between some recent directories that I've explored. I've also got a back button and a forward button if I've pressed back. It's a little bit like using a web browser. I also have an option at the top right here to perform a search. And you might be familiar with this from using Premiere Pro and browsing inside the project panel. Here, for example, if I type in the word garden, only the clips that have garden in the name are displayed. I'll just clear that search box to see all of the items in this folder. It's worth noting that what I'm looking at here is actually the media files inside the folder as they appear in Finder on macOS or in Explorer in Windows. But I have some useful filtering options. Up at the top here, I can choose, for example, to only see TIFF files. I've got some TIFF image files in this folder, and now I'm excluding items based on the file type. So I can use the name at the top right or the file type right here. I'll just change this back to all supported files. We also have this directory viewers option, which is set up to allow me to choose to view particular types of media from cameras like Red or even within Premiere Pro projects. And for now, what I'm looking at is a regular file directory, so that's the option that's highlighted. But look what happens when I go inside this Panasonic P2 folder. Right away now, I'm seeing the contents of the P2 folder as whole clips. These clips were all recorded using S-Log2, so they're very flat. They don't have a lot of dynamic range just yet, but it's easy to add later on. But you'll notice if I just increase the size of these thumbnails quite a lot, I can actually use any of the thumbnails as a little preview monitor, just as you can in the project panel. If I hover the mouse cursor on the left, I'm now seeing the beginning of the clip, and if I drag the mouse over, I'm not clicking, I'm just moving the mouse cursor over towards the right, I'm seeing the end of the clip. This is a little more obvious here if I drag through where there's some action. I can press Ctrl or Command A to select all of these three items, and I'll just shrink these thumbnails a little so they're more manageable. And I can right-click and choose Import. And now there are those three clips inside my project panel. I'm just going to go back to the media browser. I'm going to deselect by clicking on the background, and now I'm going to right-click on one of these items and choose Reveal in Explorer. Now, what's special about the media browser when working with what I would call fragmented file types is that, as you can see in the background in Premiere Pro, we're getting three individual clips. But if I navigate up a little here in Windows Explorer, so you can see the contents of the P2 folder, well, if I browse one level down, you can see we've got multiple folders that contain different parts of our media. We're not seeing any of that in the media browser, which just gives us the combined files as clips. This is really the magic of the preview functionality of the media browser. Remember that when you import into Premiere Pro, unless you enable the ingest options, which have a shortcut here at the top of the media browser panel, nothing's going to happen to the original media. Again, I'm going to navigate up one level here by clicking on the source folder on the left, and I'm going to click into the right side of the media browser panel. I'm going to press Ctrl A, that'd be Command A on macOS to select all. Then, still holding the Control key in Windows, or the Command key on macOS, I'm going to click on this P2 folder because we don't need it, we've already got it imported. And now I'm going to right-click and choose Import to bring in both the TIFF files and the MP4 files. If you move the media browser to another part of the interface, you can, of course, drag and drop from one panel to the other. It's worth noting as well, if you do import a fragmented file type folder like P2 or XDCAM from this view, then you're likely to get errors. Let's try this right now. There we go. And this error message is just advising me that I've selected things like an XML file or an XMP file to be imported as media, and they're not really media. I'll just click OK on this. No harm done. It just means that some of the items I selected can't be imported. But if I expand this newly imported P2 folder, you can see I've got just the parts that are normal media. In this case, it's some bitmap files, which isn't very helpful. The P2 viewer is triggered when you step inside a P2 folder. And of course, the same is true of XDCAM and Red and so on. Once you're inside the directory, Premiere Pro knows how it should interpret the media. It's worth noting as well, if I just go back to the source here and pick one of these MP4 files, you can double-click to open a file in the source monitor. This doesn't import the file. It just gives you the opportunity to view it using the source monitor rather than the smaller thumbnail. For this tutorial, I'm using the Import Media Directly project file. You can find that project file with the media associated with this tutorial. Just double-click on the project file directly to open it in Premiere Pro. Media files can be imported directly to Premiere Pro from Explorer in Windows or Finder in macOS. Generally, you're going to want to use the media browser panel to import media, especially if you're importing fragmented media file types like OP-Atom MXF files. But if your media is self-contained, like QuickTime movie files or MP4 files, you can drag them directly from Explorer or Finder. It's worth noting that by default, Premiere Pro uses the file path and file name to connect clips in the project with the original media files in your storage, rather than copying them to a unified project folder. This makes it valuable to pre-organize your media files. Here, for example, I've got some photos in a Photos folder. I'll just go up one level here. And I've got some video clips in a Video folder. Some of these are set near a bridge, some in a lounge, some in a garden, and I've got a P2 file drop. That means I've got the contents of a P2 folder from a Panasonic camera. I'm going to start out by creating some new folders. I'm just right-clicking here in Windows. On macOS, I can right-click and choose New Folder, and I'll call this folder Garden, and just drag these garden clips in. I'll make another folder, and call this Bridge. Let's take all of these, and another folder called Lounge. Let's take these and drop them in there as well. This is a very important part of the process. If you are going to import media directly from your operating system into Premiere Pro, you really need to get the organizational system right first. It's going to make it much easier for you to locate media later on. It'll make it easier to archive and to manage the project in general. Plus, there's a shortcut for creating bins, which I'll show you in just a moment. First of all, directly inside of Premiere Pro, I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to choose Import. This is Control-I on Windows or Command-I on macOS. Now you can see I'm already in my media folder. I'm going to go into my video folder, and let's just take this Bridge folder. Notice that I'm selecting the entire folder and not the clips inside of it, or rather, more specifically, the media files inside of it. Having selected the folder, I can either choose Open, which will browse inside of it, or I can choose Import Folder. On macOS, this just comes up as an Import button. I'm going to choose Import Folder, and right away you can see what's happened. I've got a bin inside of Premiere Pro that matches the folder name, and if I expand the contents of that folder, you can see I've got those 3 clips imported. These are MP4 files, so they're self-contained video and audio files. Again, this will only work properly if you're importing these kinds of self-contained files. I'm going to get back into the same dialog box by double-clicking on the background of the project panel. And now I'm going to navigate up a little, and I'm going to choose this P2 folder. This is the contents of a P2 card. And now I'm going to choose Import Folder again. This time I get a couple of warning messages. Premiere Pro has just been asked to import all of the subfolders inside of that P2 folder, and that includes some XMP and XML files. I'll click OK, and I'll expand this new bin, and you can see there I've got the contents folder that comes in a P2 card, and inside of that I've got this AV clip folder and all of these additional files. Some of the items in that folder simply haven't been imported because they're not actually media. This was the wrong type of folder to import directly into Premiere Pro. I'll just collapse that for a second. The media browser is always the right way to import that kind of fragmented media. Now I'm going to toggle back to my media. I'm going to browse inside this Garden folder, and let's say I want to import this Garden 02 clip. I'm just going to drag this straight into Premiere Pro. And there it is, imported. This really is the same outcome as going to File, Import, or double-clicking on the background of the project panel. I can, of course, also drag whole folders in. I'm going to go back to this video directory and take that whole Garden folder and drop it into Premiere Pro. You can see in the background there's Premiere Pro imports, and there's the Garden folder represented as a bin. You'll notice that though the folder contains 3 items, only 2 appear inside this bin. And that's because of a very interesting and useful user preference. Here in Windows, I'm going to Edit and Preferences and Media. This is under the Adobe Premiere Pro CC application menu in macOS. And in this Preferences pane, I've got this option, Allow Duplicate Media During Project Import. With this option off, which is the default, anytime you import a piece of media that's already in the project, well, it just won't appear. And you see, I already imported that media file earlier on. With this option on, I would have received all 3 clips. Now, is one option better or the other? It really comes down to how you like to work as an editor. For now, though, I'll cancel, and I'll go back to my media folder. You can also drag files directly into the timeline panel. I'm going to go into this Lounge folder and drag one of these into Premiere Pro straight into the timeline panel. And let me just toggle back over to Premiere Pro. Normally, inside of Premiere Pro, if you drag a clip into the timeline panel when it's empty, a sequence will be created that matches the settings for the clip, the same frame rate and frame size and so on. And importing directly from the file system is no different. I've now got that clip in a sequence named after the clip, TAS Lounge 003. There's the sequence in the project panel, and there's the clip that I've just imported. There is a rule in Premiere Pro that any clip incorporated into a sequence must appear in the project panel. I'm just going to select this clip in the project panel and hit the delete key, and I get a warning telling me that the clip I'm about to delete is incorporated into a sequence. If I remove the clip, it's going to be removed from the sequence. I'll just say no for now. I'm just going to select all of these items in the project panel and hit the delete key to remove them. I'm going to go back into my media folder, and let's go up a couple of levels to show the video and photos folders. I'll select them and drag them both into my project panel. I wanted to remove everything first of all, because otherwise that preference we looked at is going to stop me getting all of the items imported. When I toggle back over to Premiere Pro, I've got this file import failure dialog, the same one we saw before, because I've imported a P2 folder directly from the operating system rather than from the media browser, and I'll click OK. What's great about pre-organizing your media folders in your storage before you import is now, if I expand my video bin, you can see I've got each of these three locations already defined as bins. And there, of course, is the contents of that P2 folder. You can see because this contents has been displayed the wrong way, because I've imported directly, it's probably not so helpful to incorporate fragmented file types into the same organizational system as your self-contained media file types. I'm going to select that and remove it. It's worth noting that the relationship between the bin names inside of Premiere Pro and the folder names in your storage is really a one-way trip. I can change the names of these bins. Let's say I'll just call this new name to make it really obvious. And if I go back to my media folders and browse inside my video folder, you can see that the folder name has not changed. So importing your media in such a way that it produces matching bin names is just a really useful shortcut, and it makes it worthwhile pre-organizing and pre-naming your folders before you begin. For this tutorial, I'm using the Relink Offline Clips project file. You can find that project file with the media associated with this tutorial. Just double-click on the project file to open it in Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro uses the file path and file name to connect clips with media files. That means if you move media files to a new location, the link no longer works and clips go offline. I'm going to toggle over to this media folder where we have our various video and photo files. Premiere Pro is so good at relocating items that just doing something like renaming a folder won't make clips go offline. I'm going to rename this Photos folder Old and toggle back to Premiere Pro. You probably just saw there the Locating Media dialog flash up on screen, and if I go into this Photos bin, you can see those items are still online. However, I have a physically separate drive connected to this computer, and I'm going to move all of the video files from its current location onto that drive. I'll just drag this over, and I'm holding the Shift key so that I'm moving rather than copying the files. Now, when I go back to Premiere Pro, we get this Link Media dialog. The default settings are usually fine. You've got options here for the way that Premiere Pro is going to identify the files that are missing. And again, we're speaking about files here that are linked to by clips in the project file. And over on the right, we've got some options for the way that we're going to locate the content. Again, the defaults are usually fine. Here's the list of items that are missing. And you'll notice that the photos are not on the list because, of course, those are in their original location. Because I've got this option, Use Media Browser to Locate Files, enabled, when I click Locate, instead of just getting a regular system browser, I actually get a kind of a version of the media browser with which I can preview files as well as just browse to locate them. I'll resize a little so we've got a bit more room. Down at the bottom of this Locate File dialog box, I'm going to enable Display Only Exact Name Matches. This is going to hide anything that isn't a folder or the file that I need. I'm going to go to the drive that contains the media, and looking at the top, I can see the last path, the last known location of this clip. The first item on the list is actually a P2 MXF media file, so it's tucked away inside multiple subfolders rather than being right there in the media folder. We've got the currently selected path just underneath it. Because I've got quite a lot of other files on this drive, all inside this other files folder, I'm not going to search right away. I'm going to speed up the search just a little by browsing into this media folder. Now I'm going to click Search, and Premiere Pro has found exactly the file we need. If you look at the new path at the top, we're now looking at the D drive rather than the C drive. On macOS, you get drive names rather than drive letters, but it's the same principle. Because I've got Display Only Exact Name Matches enabled, I'm not seeing the other items in this folder. I'll just deselect that, and you can see the other media files here. We don't need those. The file is already highlighted. I can hover scrub by moving my mouse cursor over this thumbnail to see the contents of it, but I know it's the right one, and I'm going to click OK. When I clicked OK, Premiere Pro automatically checked the relative locations for the other missing media files. That means even if the other media files were not in the same directory, Premiere Pro knows that, for example, the original folder was beside this one or even a couple of levels up. And so in one step, every one of these media files has come online. This is not going to work if you've moved your media folders to different relative locations, or for that matter, to different drives. But in the main, you're going to find that this single step is all you need to do to relink your media. I'm going to go back to my media folders, and I'm going to move, again with the Shift key, my media back over to the original drive. Now, when I go back into Premiere Pro, you'll notice that the clips link automatically, and that's because Premiere Pro has remembered the previously known locations for this media. I can also manually set clips to be offline. Here, for example, I'm going to right-click on one of the items in my project panel, and I'm going to choose Make Offline. You do have this dangerous option to delete media files when you do this. This is one of the rare occasions that Premiere Pro will allow you to do anything to your original media. You generally do not want this option to delete the file. I'm going to click OK to keep the media files on disk. Now, if I double-click on this item, I get the Edit Offline File dialog box. You'll notice I have the option to specify a tape name. That's if this was captured from a tape. I can put in a description, log notes, and so on. Now, instead, I'm going to right-click and I'm going to choose Link Media. This is distinct from the Replace Footage option, which replaces the original media file with any media you like, whether or not it matches the original file. So I'm going to choose Link Media, and this takes me back into the Link Media dialog box. And I just wanted to run over a couple more of these options. If you are having trouble relinking media, you might want to enable or disable some of these match file properties options, in particular the file extension. Provided you have unique file names, if you're changing the media type, you might need to turn this option off. The Align Timecode option just aligns the clip timecode with the media file. And of course here we've got the Relink Others Automatically option, which we want if we're relinking multiple clips. With this turned off, when I had clicked OK previously, we would have just come back to this dialog to relink each clip individually. We've already looked at the Use Media Browser to Locate Files option. If I deselect this and choose Locate, I go to a regular system dialog box to browse for the file, and that might be fine. The Preserve Interpret Footage Settings option means that any clip interpretation you've applied in the project panel will also be applied to the newly connected clip. If you choose Offline All or Offline, which selects an individual item, Premiere Pro will just skip to the next item on the list, or in this case, take you back to the project panel, and it'll allow those clips to remain offline even when you reopen the project. So that's how to relink offline clips in Adobe Premiere Pro CC. For this tutorial, I'm using the multi-layer Photoshop Files project file. You can find that project file with the media associated with this tutorial. Just double click on the project file to open it in Premiere Pro. And in fact, the project file is an empty one. There's nothing in here yet because we're going to import something in a moment. I'm also working with this TAS main title PSD file. And if I switch over to Photoshop, you can see the contents of that file. This is a multi-layer Photoshop document, and you can see there are text layers, there are some shapes, there's a black background, and there's a layer effect applied to one of the layers. That's this smoky background. Premiere Pro has the Photoshop display engine built in, so you can access and work with individual layers in Photoshop documents directly. I'm going over to Premiere Pro, and in fact, it doesn't really matter how you import a Photoshop document, you'll get the same options. Here, I'm going to right-click on the background of the project panel, and I'm going to choose Import. And in my Media folder, I'm going to select this Photoshop document and click Open. When you import a Photoshop document, you get this Import Layered File dialog box, where you can choose the way that the multiple layers in the PSD are going to be imported. Everything hangs on this Import As menu, and by default, Merge All Layers will give you a single clip in the Premiere Pro project panel. All of the enabled layers in the PSD, that's the ones that already have checkboxes on them here, will be incorporated into that single clip. I'll just click OK, and there's our PSD. If I double click to open this, it pops up in my source monitor. But what if I don't want every single layer? In fact, I don't think I really want that full layer of black behind my text and behind my shapes. Well, I'm going to right click again and choose Import, choose the PSD and click Open. And this time, instead of Merge All Layers, I'm going to choose Merge Layers. It's a subtle difference in the description, and now I can select only the layers I want to be incorporated into that merged single clip. In this case, for example, I'm just going to deselect layer 2, which has got the black background, and this will leave me with transparent areas in the title, so I can put it in front of another background. You've got some pretty straightforward options here to select all the layers or none of the layers and reset the selection to match the original document. But I'm just going to click OK, and I'll double click to open this in the source monitor. And right now it looks identical, but if I go to my settings menu in the source monitor, and it's worth noting here that I'm in the assembly workspace, so my source monitor's over on the right with my program monitor. I'm going to turn on transparency grid, and right away you can see the difference. If I double click on the original version that has the black layer, you can see that the whole background is covered up. It's worth noting that any changes you make in a Photoshop document will update automatically inside of Premiere Pro. You're not really copying anything anywhere when you import, you're just creating a link to it. So if I go back to Photoshop, for example, and just to illustrate this, I'll select these shape layers. I'm just holding the Shift key down to select all of them. And I'll select the Shape tool to give me the shape fill color and choose another color that updates in the PSD. It won't change in Premiere Pro until you save. So I'm going to go to File and choose Save. And now when I toggle back to Premiere Pro, you can see right away every instance has updated. I'll just go back to Photoshop, undo with Control Z or Command Z on macOS, and save with Control S or Command S, and back in Premiere Pro it updates again. This is not quite the same thing as Dynamic Link, where the changes will update whether or not you save, but still it's pretty convenient. Now I'm going to right click again and choose Import, choose this document again and choose Open. And this time, instead of the Merged Layers option or the Merge All Layers option, I'm going to choose Individual Layers. When you import individual layers from a Photoshop document, each item comes in as a separate clip. So again, here, I might as well keep that layer 2, but I've got an additional option here, the footage dimensions. When this menu is set to document size, regardless of the size of the item on the layer, the entire clip will be the full dimensions of the Photoshop document. In this case, I happen to know it's an HD 1920 by 1080 PSD. That means, for example, that this text that you see in the center of the screen will remain in the center, and these red lines will remain at the top right corner or bottom left corner. If instead I change this menu to layer size, then each item, each layer that is, will be imported at only the dimensions of that layer. This means that every item will appear in the center of the screen. You won't maintain the relative positions of the contents of the layers. Now, there are reasons why you would want to do this. You might, for example, be using a PSD where multiple layers of the PSD are intended to be completely separate clips. But in this case, I'm going to switch back to document size and I'm going to click OK. Now I get a bin which contains all of those clips. And if I double click to open this up, you can see that I've got each individual layer. See, I can double click on each of these, and these are still linked to the original Photoshop document. If I make any changes, each of these items will be updated. I'm just going to go back to my project panel, and I've got one more version of this to import. I'm going to right click and choose import. I'm going to just double click on the item this time, and in the import as menu, I'm going to choose sequence. Instead of importing just individual clips, I'm also going to have a sequence made from those clips. So I'll click OK. Again, I've got a bin named after the Photoshop document, but you'll notice even in the icon view, one of these items has a different symbol in the bottom right-hand corner. This is a sequence. I'll just double click to open this up, and I'll zoom in a little on the navigator and reposition my tracks just a little. Let's resize. And you can see that I've got every separate clip as a separate layer in this sequence. Now, I could have done this manually. It just saves a few clicks. And you'll notice that each clip has a short duration, and that's set in the user preferences. Here in Windows under Edit, Preferences, in macOS in the Adobe Premiere Pro CC application menu, and Timeline. The still image default duration applies to any graphic content that you create or import into Premiere Pro. So, for example, this applies to adjustment layers, just as it applies to imported still images, and a Photoshop document is a still image. You can change this default duration, or I'll just cancel here. Of course, like any other clip in a sequence, you can trim to change the duration of each of these clips in the timeline panel. For this tutorial, I'm using the Mixed Footage Premiere Pro project file. You can find that project file with the media associated with the tutorial. Just double click on it to open it in Premiere Pro. This project already has some media imported. I've got some video clips and a few photos. And in fact, these video clips are in multiple formats. I'm going to double click on the panel name for the project panel so we can see these headings a bit more clearly. I'm in the list view, you can see at the bottom left of the panel. In this view, I've got access to quite a lot of additional information about these clips. And what I'm particularly interested in is right here, the video info heading. We can see that our photos are pretty high resolution. They also don't really match any standard video resolution. And if we look at our video clips, we can see we've got some that are regular HD, that's 1920 by 1080, and we've got some that are UHD or ultra high definition, that's 3840 by 2160. I want to make a distinction here between UHD, which is exactly double the height and width of regular HD, and 4K, which is 4096 by 2160 pixels. It's a little bit wider. When you add clips to a sequence, those clips are automatically adjusted for playback to match the sequence settings, and this process is called conforming. The sequence settings are the same as any media file. If I go into the new item menu here and choose sequence and look at the settings, you can see I've got things like a frame size and a pixel aspect ratio and so on. I'll just cancel that for a second. Normally, you would aim to match your sequence settings to your media, and this minimizes conversion and maximizes quality. But when you're working with mixed footage, as I am here, you're going to have to make a choice about which content you want to match your sequence and which you're going to adjust. All other footage is going to be conformed automatically. I'm going to take one of these HD clips and I'm going to drag it all the way down here to the new item menu. And that's a shortcut to create a sequence based on that clip. And here you can see we've got the sequence in our project panel with the matching name. I'm going to rename this master sequence, and I'll just pull it out of the bin there so it's separate. Let's collapse this bin as well. And there you can see our sequence. This is a great workflow, but I've now specified that my sequence should have settings that match that clip rather than any other clip. So I better hope that those are the right settings. I'm going to go to the sequence menu and choose sequence settings. And let's take a look at what we've got. Well, this was an HD clip, 1920 by 1080. You can see the time base is 23.976 frames per second. That's an NTSC drop frame version of 24 frames per second. And everything else looks pretty standard. Square pixels and no fields because this is progressive media. You can change any setting you like in the sequence settings, at least in terms of the visuals. And one thing you can't change is the audio mastering. That's the audio output options. And that's because the sequence will give you options for audio that match your output type. You'll get pan pots, for example, if you're outputting to stereo. Now let's take a look back inside this project panel. I'm going to just expand the video bin so we can see its contents. If I scroll over a little, very helpfully, we keep seeing the name. And there we go. I can see my video info. And it looks to me like we have 3 clips that are UHD and 4 that are HD. If I scroll back over just a little bit, we can see that the frame rates do differ as well. Or do they? As I mentioned just now, 23.976 is an NTSC drop frame version of 24 frames per second media. And in fact, it doesn't have any impact on playback until you get to the point of broadcasting. And that's really over a terrestrial TV network. In fact, when you're playing back media, whether it's drop frame or not, in pretty much any other circumstance, it's actually going to be the full frame rate. That means that this 23.976 media is actually going to play back at 24. So in that respect, we don't have to worry about frame rate conversions. And that's the type of conversion, or conforming in this case, that's likely to produce the biggest impact on picture quality. So nothing to worry about there. If they did have differing frame rates, then I would suggest choosing a frame rate that more closely matches the majority of your clips. Or there are some cases where you'd want to have them match your delivery standard, but that's a whole other conversation. Now, I'm going to take these 3 UHD clips, and I'm holding the Shift key down there to create a list selection, and I'm going to drag these into my sequence. I'll just put a little gap in there, and I'll resize the track a little so we can see our thumbnails and our audio. Not that we're so concerned about our audio right now. And right away, we're going to discover we have a problem. I'm going to click to move my playhead over, and we can see that because this is an HD timeline, but the footage is UHD, we're getting a kind of cookie cutter effect. We're losing the edges of the image. Just to illustrate this, I'm going to press F for frame. This is the keyboard shortcut for match frame. It's going to open the original master clip in the source monitor. And you can see just how much of this image we're losing. So I'm going to want to scale these clips down. And I can do that by right-clicking on the timeline, and I can choose either scale to frame size or set to frame size. Now, scale to frame size will re-rasterize the image at the new image resolution. And that's good because it speeds up rendering for effects, but it's bad because if you want to pan and scan around inside the image, you're actually zooming into the newly rasterized lower image resolution. The other option, set to frame size, really just changes the scale parameter in the effect controls panel. And the upside with that is that you get all of the original resolution of your media. And the downside is that it's going to be more work to render effects. I'm going to choose that option. And if we go to our effect controls panel and I expand the motion category, you can see that our scale setting has changed to 50%. And that makes a lot of sense because UHD is twice the resolution horizontally and vertically relative to HD. We can actually apply this change to other clips as a group all in one step. So I'm going to make a marquee selection to choose both of these clips. I'm going to right click and choose set to frame size, and both clips have been resized. There's also a user preference to apply this set to frame size or scale to frame size option as clips are imported. Let me just collapse this video bin, and I'm going to go to Edit and Preferences. This would be the Adobe Premiere Pro CC application menu on macOS. And I'm going to go to Media. In the Media Preferences, I have a default media scaling option. I'm going to choose Set to Frame Size and click OK. Now I'm going to look in my Photos bin, and I'll just drag one of these photos into my sequence so we can see the result. Well, we've got a bit of an issue, because although we now have the full image displayed inside the HD frame, because the image doesn't match the aspect ratio of our HD sequence, we're getting what are sometimes called pillar boxes. That's these black bars on the right and left of the image. If the image was wider than HD, we would get classic letterboxing, which would be black lines at the top and bottom. Of course, we can fix this pretty easily by selecting the photo, and here's our scale setting. We can scale this back up. I'm just clicking and dragging. And if I want to reposition the image, I can click on the motion heading in the Effect Controls panel. And now the clip's selected, so I can reframe it and choose another composition. If you intend to work with still images often, and you don't intend to pan and scan around them with keyframes, it might be worth pre-preparing them so they have the same aspect ratio as your sequence. This will save time during the edit, and it'll also have less of an impact on the memory on your system, which might make the whole thing snappier. So that's working with mixed footage in Adobe Premiere Pro CC. For this tutorial, I'm using the Mixed Frame Rates project file. You can find that project file with the media associated with this tutorial. Just double-click on the project file to open it in Premiere Pro. There are several common footage frame rates. If the frame rate doesn't match your sequence frame rate, you're going to have to make some decisions about how the footage is going to be conformed. And that's exactly what happens when you add a clip to a sequence that doesn't have matching settings. Either frames will be dropped or new frames will be generated to fill in some gaps. Remember that footage is made up of a series of frames. You can play them at any speed you like. This is a 24 frames per second piece of video of the rooftops of New York. And it's worth noting that regardless of the settings for your sequence, you'll always see the native frame rate in the source monitor. This is a really useful way of comparing and contrasting the results of any speed change adjustments you've made in a sequence. The sequence I've got open right now is set to 30 frames per second. And as you can see from the frame rate heading here, and in fact the names of the clips in the project panel, I've got some 24 frames per second and some 96 frames per second media. But interestingly, you'll notice that this 96 frames per second media, well, that information's just in the file name really, is still listed as 24 frames per second in the project panel. And that's because though I happen to know that that footage was recorded at 96 frames per second, the camera has a second frame rate setting, which is the system frequency or the system frame rate. That stream of frames will play back at the frame rate set by the camera, in this case 24 frames per second. The result is, in this case, of course, we get slow motion. I'll just double click on one of these to open them up, and you can see if I play, the result is very slow movement. But this type of slow motion is beautifully smooth because we're not generating additional frames of content, we're not adding gaps. The camera actually ran 4 times faster, and now we're playing back at normal speed. Still, I'm going to take one of these 24 frames per second pieces of media and drop it into my sequence. And right away, you see I'm getting this clip mismatch warning. Premiere Pro is letting me know that the clip doesn't match the sequence's settings. You're only going to get this warning once, and it's the first time you add a clip to an existing sequence. I can choose to change the sequence settings to match the clip, but on this occasion, I want to keep the existing settings. Without me doing anything else at all, Premiere Pro has now conformed the clip to the new frame rate using the most efficient rendering method for playback performance. I'll just click into the middle of the clip here, and there's no audio on this clip, and let's play it back. Well, it actually looks okay. Still, I'm going to right-click on this clip and I'm going to go into the speed duration dialog box. And this is where you can specify new playback speeds for your clips in a sequence. What I'm particularly interested in here is the time interpolation option. The default option is frame sampling, where frames are either added or removed to give you the correct frame rate for your sequence. Frame blending is a more subtle approach. It's a little bit more work for playback. It's often smoother, but sometimes perhaps a little bit softer. Both of these options are real-time. That means they'll play back without rendering, provided you have a real-time system. That's one set up with the right kind of GPU, for example. But we also have this option, optical flow, which is a much more advanced system for calculating frames that need to be added or removed from your footage. Now, you'd normally use this to produce good quality slow motion from footage that was not overcranked, footage that was shot at a normal frame rate. But this setting is also used to choose the way Premiere Pro will calculate frame rate mismatches between your footage and your sequence. I'm going to turn this option on and click OK. And you can see the line along the top of the timeline panel goes red to tell me that this needs to be rendered. The quality is exceptional, but in order for you to get the playback performance that you need, it needs to be pre-rendered. Now, I want to take a look at some of this 96 frames per second media. I'm going to double-click to open this up in the source monitor, and you can see we've got this lovely slow motion. And if I put this clip in our 24 frames per second sequence, it'll play fine there as well. Let's just jump on a little. And that's because the media is configured to play back at 24 frames per second, and the sequence is also 24 frames per second. But I don't have to have the clip play back at that frame rate. I'm going to right-click on the clip in the project panel and go to Modify and choose Interpret Footage. And up at the top here, we can see we can either use the frame rate from the file, that's the frame rate set by the camera, or we can specify a new frame rate. Take a look at the duration here. I'm just going to set this to 24 frames per second first of all. And you can see that at 24 frames per second, it's about 50 seconds duration. If I set this to 48 frames per second, which is still half the speed it was originally filmed at, the duration halves. And that makes a lot of sense. We're playing back at twice the speed, so we have half the duration. I'll just click OK, and I'll drag the timeline over a little, and you can see now the clip in the sequence has these diagonal lines to show that while the clip in the sequence still exists, it's not going to interfere with the timing of your edits. We now only have half of the duration. And if I play this back, it's still pretty good slow motion, but it's twice as fast as it was before. In fact, Premiere Pro has still conformed this clip. It's taken it down from 48 frames per second to 24, but rather than doing that by slowing down the playback of the clip, it's done it by removing unnecessary frames. I can actually achieve the same result by taking one of these other 24 frames per second clips that was shot at 96 frames per second, right-clicking, going into the speed duration dialog, setting the playback speed to 200%, and clicking OK. And now, if I play this, we get a similar speed of slow motion. So in one case, I'm telling Premiere Pro to play back the master clip, if you like, at a faster frame rate, and in the other, I'm making an adjustment to the clip inside an existing sequence. And you can easily combine those two types of setting. So you could start with your regular frames per second and add those clips to your sequence, and then use things like time remapping or speed duration changes to add some creative playback speed adjustments. So that's working with mixed frame rates in Adobe Premiere Pro CC. Exporting a sequence from Adobe Premiere Pro can be as simple as selecting the sequence. I'm working with a scene here from the film See You Around, adding in and out marks if you want to export just a part of it, choosing File, Export, Media, or pressing Ctrl or Command M, choosing a format and a preset, selecting a file name and location, and clicking Export. The presets are carefully configured to give you a dependable quality for your output. You can also choose to only export the video or the audio. Before we really get into the export settings dialog, I'd like to mention the sequence settings. I'm going to cancel out of here and I'm going to go to my sequence menu and choose sequence settings. A sequence has format settings, just as a media file does. Whenever you add clips to a sequence, they will automatically be conformed to match these settings. That is, whatever their original frame rate, frame size, and so on, they will be adjusted to match these sequence settings. So now let's export this sequence. And it's worth noting that when you're exporting a sequence, rather than a clip, which you can also do, the sequence is the source. And we can see the settings for this sequence here in the middle of this dialog. This information is helpful because it gives you a quick way to compare your sequence format and your output format. And if at any time your output differs from your source, there's the potential for quality loss. So you'll generally want these to match. I should mention it's normal to choose options in this dialog based on a deliverable specification provided to you by your client. All of the major broadcast TV stations, for example, have specifications for media delivery, so you don't have to guess at the right options to choose. There are 4 main areas in the export settings dialog, separated by thick black lines. Top left, we get a preview of our output and the option to crop the output. Bottom left, we can choose which part of our sequence we will export. Top right is all of the options that define the new file that we're going to create. And bottom right, we have some standard options to do with encoding in general, like setting a new start timecode and the way to render frame rate differences if you're outputting to a format that differs from your sequence. So let's start at the top. This Match Sequence Settings option will produce a file that matches your current render settings. It's useful for many workflows, but not usually what you'll choose when exporting, because you'll usually have a specific file type in mind. So I'll turn this off. Use the Format menu to choose a category of media file type. There are industry standard options, including AS11, up to 12-bit DPX, and QuickTime. I'll choose H.264 as a popular illustrative example. QuickTime movies are well established as a delivery format, but if you're producing content for online distribution, you're likely to find H.264 is the most commonly requested file type. For a preset, I'm going to choose YouTube 1080p HD. I'm going to click on the output name, and I'll give this a simple name, something like Final Output, and click Save. After our summary, we have several important tabs, each with settings that will change the output. If you use a preset, these are all set appropriately for the preset already, but there are some interesting additional options you might choose. I'm going to start with the Video tab. This lets you specify the width and height, frame rate, and so on for your media. If you click Match Source at the top, the output will be set automatically based on your sequence. And further down, at the bottom of this list, there are some options specific to the chosen format. The Audio tab has similar standard options for audio output. And again, there are some settings specific to the chosen format. Not every format includes multiplexer options, which sets the way audio and video are combined in the finished file. And if your sequence has captions, you can set the way they're combined with the output in the Captions tab. The Publish tab offers several ways to automate publishing your work on social media platforms, including Adobe Stock. And the Effects tab offers quite a list of adjustments, overlays, and ways to tune your output. Some of these are functional, like the video limiter, which keeps levels below a threshold you set to be absolutely sure your output meets the deliverable limits. And some are more artistic, like applying a Lumetri look. If you save a preset, all of the settings on the tabs are included, which is great if you want to create a workflow for standard output. Now that I've set my image format, I'm seeing the result in the Output tab. This media has some built-in letterboxing, which is these black lines at the top and bottom. I can fix that by going to the Source tab and turning on the crop option. And I can adjust the crop either with the numbers up here at the top or by dragging. I'm going to overdo this so you can see the result here in the Output tab, where I can choose the way the aspect ratio for my newly cropped source will fit into the output aspect ratio. For now, I'm going to turn off the crop and leave things as they are. Down at the bottom of the Export Settings dialog, I have the option to specify the part of the sequence that's going to be exported. If you add in and out marks, they are used by default, and if you don't, you'll get the entire contents of the sequence. You can override the in and out marks that you've added here by dragging the start and end of the part of the sequence you want to export. And you'll notice my source range is updated here in the menu to custom. I'm going to use this menu to go back to exporting the entire sequence. It's a really good idea to export a short section of your sequence to check that you're happy with the result before you export the entire sequence, particularly if it's a longer sequence. When you're ready, click Export to create the file. If you click Q, Adobe Media Encoder will launch and perform the encoding in the background, so you can carry on editing while the new media file is being created. Media Encoder allows you to batch encode jobs rather than outputting one job at a time. I'm going to check the box to import the finished file into Premiere Pro so I can view it right away, and click Export to perform the encoding right out of Premiere Pro. Exporting directly this way uses all of your system resources to output the file as quickly as possible. And now I'll go back to my project panel, and here's my output. I can double-click to open this in the source monitor, or I can right-click and choose Reveal in Explorer, that'd be Finder on macOS, and see the file that was just created.